right, hello, welcome. Welcome to the Joint Concussion Legacy Foundation Media Project, the Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism webinar, covering concussions, how sportswriters can nail a complicated topic. I'm Dr. Chris Nowinski, CEO and co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. At CLF, part of our mission is to achieve smarter sports and safer kids through education and innovation. And one of the principal ways we are educating is through the CLF Media Project, the first and only concussion reporting training designed specifically for sports media and sports media students. Today, you'll hear from 4 Medill alumni with decades of concussion reporting experience between them. We'll talk to J.A. Adande, Director of Sports Journalism at Medill, Christine Brennan, columnist for USA Today, Matt Baker, college and recruiting reporter for the Tampa Bay Times, and Mark Lazerus, a senior writer for The Athletic. We'll end today's webinar with an open discussion with all 4 of our panelists about concussion reporting and ask them for some advice in approaching some common concussion reporting scenarios. We'll also take a few questions from the panel, so feel free to add them on the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Before we get to our guests, I want to share with you how the Media Project came to be. While we've made a lot of progress in how we talk about concussions, one important problem persists. How do we educate children on concussions? We need to educate children because most concussions can't be seen by an outside observer. So for a concussion to be diagnosed, in most cases, we need the child to recognize their own symptoms and respond appropriately by reporting their symptoms to an adult. But how do we educate them? It's really hard. First, concussion education for kids isn't mandated in most states. Second, the CDC has shown that whether or not children are ever receive concussion education is strongly influenced by their parents' wealth. Third, there are questions as to how effective classroom training is, especially for the younger children. So I was discussing this with Hall of Fame sportscaster Bob Costas, and I mentioned that sometimes progress on concussion education can also be undone when broadcasters use out-of-date terms like ding or bell ringer, or sports writers might make a hero out of a player improperly returned after a concussion. And Bob made the point that those mistakes, as I saw them, were simply due to a lack of training on this rapidly changing concussion conversation. It was there we realized that if we could provide a service helping sports media professionals cover concussions more accurately and use more up-to-date terminology, we would better educate children, parents, and their coaches watching. NFL games average 1 concussion per game. I see that as a teaching opportunity for the millions of fans watching and following. So from there, we developed the Media Project, which has 2 arms, the Concussion Reporting Certification for working professionals and the Concussion Reporting Workshop for journalism students. So the Media Project would not be possible without CLF Program Coordinator Brandon Boyd, who's traveled the country teaching the workshop. So I'd like to welcome Brandon to join me now and share more about the Media Project curriculum. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chris, for that very kind intro. As mentioned, I manage the Media Project, and I'm very proud of all the work we've accomplished here in just a year and a half since we launched it. As a former teacher and lifelong sports fan, it's been an honor to be a part of the Media Project and to teach it to journalism students all over the country. We launched the Media Project at a press conference in New York City in the fall of 2018 and piloted the workshop at 3 schools, first with J.A. and his classes at Medill, then with Professor Andrea Kramer and her class at Boston University, and then Professor Olivia Stomsky at Syracuse University's Newhouse School. The backbone of the Media Project is our 22 Do's for covering concussions. We developed this resource with input from JA and our other advisors to provide tangible and concrete lessons for sports media pros to use in their work when they're covering concussions or potential concussions. The 22 Do's includes lessons about what to do before an event, like making sure you know your concussion protocols, what to do when a potential concussion occurs, such as not using antiquated terms like Chris mentioned, ding or bell ringer, shaking off the cobwebs, what have you, or after a concussion has been diagnosed, like not using the term mild concussion. You can find and download this free resource at concussionfoundation.org/22do's, the URL there on your screen. The 22 Do's dictate the content for the 2 main arms of the Media Project that Chris had mentioned. First, the Concussion Reporting Workshop, which is a standalone class to educate sports media students. The workshop has been taught by Professor Adande at Northwestern, as well as many of the other top sports journalism schools across the country, including Missouri, ASU, NYU, and many more. You can learn more about how the workshop works and how you can bring it to your school at concussionfoundation.org/workshop. The second arm, our concussion reporting certification, is a 20-question quiz designed to teach sports media pros the 22 lessons with scenario-based questions. Nearly 100 sports media pros are already certified, including Bob Costas, Andrew Kramer, Sean McDonough, and many more of the faces you see here who work on the print journalism side of things. You can join them and get certified yourself at concussionfoundation.org/certify. If anyone has any questions about the media project, I'd be happy to answer them over email at bboyd@concussionfoundation.org. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again soon in the panel.
Thank you, Brandon. So right now it's time to bring in our first esteemed guest. As I mentioned, J.A. Adande has been instrumental in both the development and the success of the media project. He provided valuable input as we were building our resources, hosted Brennan for the first workshop in his graduate and undergraduate classes in 2018, and continues to teach it. You've probably seen him most recently as a frequent interview on the Last Dance documentary on ESPN, which everyone's talking about. He's also a regular panelist for ESPN's Around the Horn, but his first big role in the field was a sports columnist for the LA Times. Now he's director of sports journalism at Medill, and we're thrilled to have him join us. So J.A., thanks for joining, buddy.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So let's start with your experience covering concussions from back in your reporting days. I remember you told a great story about how you struggled to find the NBA's concussion protocol when you're a sideline reporter. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was a time when I was reporting on a player coming back and where he stood and what the NBA had to do. And I knew the NBA had released something, and I just wasn't sure where to find it or where it stood. And, I called the spokesperson for the league, and he said, we put this out already. You should have been aware of it. And I said, I know it exists. I just couldn't remember exactly what happened. And so he said, here it is. And I went back and looked for when they announced it. Well, they announced it like on the day that Chris Paul was traded to the Clippers. So there was some pretty big other news going on at that time. But I felt good that at least I knew it existed. So I knew to ask about it so I could be brought up to speed on it. And so much of this is about awareness, right? So just being aware that there's a protocol, maybe you don't have to have it absolutely memorized, but, just know that it exists, know that you can reference it, know that there are certain steps that these leagues have now mandated players take in order to be cleared to return to play. It's not just so as simple as go to the sidelines, wave a smelling salt under the nose and, look in their eyes and clear them to go back. That there's a series of steps that they have to pass in order to be cleared to play again. And even if you don't have those memorized, know at least that they exist and reference them so you're not putting misinformation out there.
Right. Yeah. So when I reached out to you back in 2017 and said we had this idea brewing and we thought you might be the right person to help us build it, why did you say yes? Why do you think this information, is so important, to teach all of your students?
Specifically, examples like that, and the way you had put it to me, that the fear of misinformation and how sports media can, if not perpetuate the problem, make it even worse. Through improper language, through failure to recognize what's going on. It's funny, I think back to, I was sort of thrown into it, and when I first started my column, I was in the Orange County edition of the LA Times in the late 90s, and Paul Correa was the star player for the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, and he got a concussion. And I remember being brought up to speed because it was one of those ones that just didn't get better right away, and it went on and on. And one of the things I learned about at that time was that concussions are an ongoing event. It's not like you break a bone and that's the injury. It's an injury that can change over time, that doesn't necessarily happen initially and that's it. You have to study it and be aware of the changes that it can make over time. Other ways to prevent concussion. I had people emailing me saying, hey, we sell a mouthpiece that'll help reduce the risk of concussions. All these things I was learning. So I think I could have covered that better if I had been aware of those things ahead of time rather than having to learn them on the fly.
Right. And so how did your students react the first time you taught the workshop?
They've shown a lot of interest. I thought it was interesting. Last year, when we taught it in class. And then later on, I gave them the option to go further in depth and do a presentation on any of the topics that we've done thus far in class. And I noticed that maybe 40% of them chose to work on concussions even more. So
Wow.
it showed the interest, and and it's such a prevalent thing, something that you see happen every Sunday during NFL season, and yet we really don't know that much about it. And with the NFL being such a prominent sport, of course, it's a big part of other sports like hockey, for instance, but the NFL dominates so much of our sports talk discussion, and we really should be paying better attention and have a better understanding of this critical element of it.
And I'm just curious, we pre and post test your students. So what sort of knowledge do they come in on this at the beginning, and what are they walking away from in just with a few hours of training?
I'd say it's pretty minimal at first. Something that they haven't thought about, something that they're aware of, but they're not up to speed on the terminology and some of the way things are phrased, for example. And I think they do pick it up pretty quick. And I think the way that this seminar is laid out, the workshop is laid out, it makes it pretty clear, and it does show you the things to avoid as well as the proper terminology to use and what the risk is when you use improper terminology. So I think it's a very logical process, and it helps them to very quickly pick up what you're trying to impart on them.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you helping us build it. So we're going to circle back with you then for a panel discussion here. We're going to talk to everybody else for a few minutes first. So thank you again for playing the role you do, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
You got it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, J.A. And now we are excited to welcome Christine Brennan, another Medill alum. She's a professor of practice at Medill currently, and also an many award-winning sports columnist for USA Today. She's really a pioneer in the sports journalism field. She was the first female sports writer at the Miami Herald, the first to cover Washington Redskins at the Washington Post, the first president for our good friends at the Association for Women in Sports Media, and bravely took on the issue back when no one else was talking about it. We've been on many panels together. She's interviewed me a few times for stories, so it's good to reconnect here. Christine, thanks for joining us.
Chris, my pleasure. Great to be on with you, and of course, all my fellow Wildcats. Thank you so much for doing this, and thanks for having me.
So you have decades of experience covering sports. What's the first time you remember concussions becoming part of the national conversation? Oh,
that's a good one. It's been relatively recent. I mean, for those of us who were covering sports in the 80s, yeah, it was a player was exalted to the point that J.A. was making for toughing it out. I covered the NFL basically throughout the 80s, college football, pro football, and I cannot tell you the number of times someone had a dinger, someone got his bell rung. Dexter Manley, when I was covering the Washington NFL team, I try not to say the name too much anymore.
Yeah.
And of course, it's understandable. That is the name, but it's racist and wrong. But that's another story for another day. Anyway, Dexter Manley said he wanted to ring Jim McMahon's clock. He said, as opposed to ring his bell. Dexter Manley always had interesting quotes when he was playing for Washington. But this was a playoff game. It was a very, very big deal. It became a screaming headline in the Chicago Sun-Times. At the time, I was working for the Washington Post, and I was the beat writer. And yes, it's this, ring his bell, clean his clock, whatever. Dexter got it all wrong. But this was not horrifying. This was not something the way we would react now. And I can tell that things have changed, because you hear that now, and that would be a screaming headline, a big headline in a newspaper, in this case in Chicago. And I'm sure it was a headline in my story in the Post as well. And now you cringe when you hear something like that. So, I think really in this century, and certainly over the last number of years, with some of the very, very big names with the CTE issue, the awareness, and I'll speak also on the side of women's sports, which I know you and I have talked about as well. When you have Brianna Scurry, one of the stars of the '99 Women's World Cup soccer team, and basically in a room for several weeks and months, I think, unable to come out because I couldn't see light because she'd been kicked in the head while playing in the Women's Pro Soccer League, then having surgery, and then becoming a spokesperson as well. And then you also have Brandi Chastain, who, among many other people, as you know, Chris, has said that she will wants to have her brain donated, obviously, when she passes away, to have her head looked at. Obviously, the cover girl, all those magazine covers back in '99 after she had the winning penalty kick. So I think the awareness for me has really been in this century, and probably even in the last, 10, 12 years, I think is when we really have reached critical mass, thanks to you and thanks to so many others who have brought this issue to the forefront.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, speaking of those so many others, what do you think the media's role has been in changing the way the public thinks about concussions and head trauma in sports, and really all the progress that we have made over the last decade?
Oh, I think it's been huge. I think at one point I remember thinking, I may have even written it, I don't remember if I wrote it or not, but that the steroids, performance-enhancing drugs, Chris, were really that huge story. We were in the midst of the steroids era, kind of off and running on that with Ben Johnson and the Carl Lewis race back in '88 in Seoul. And I was at the finish line there at the Olympics in Seoul, covering that. 3 days later, Ben Johnson kicked out of the Olympics. And that's when that story started to explode in our consciousness. Baseball, McGuire, Sosa, all those things. I really have seen a parallel arc, if you will, of this kind of conversation, from kind of, no big deal, whatever, to this is huge. These are big names, the Junior Seau story, so many others, Tony Dorsett, you name the names. I mean, you could go on and on the rest of our hour just on that.
Yeah.
Names that bring this to light. Frank Gifford, that's when we were on the ABC Sunday Morning Show, talking about Frank Gifford and what an important message that his family was giving out by letting us know that he had CTE, that was found after he had passed away. The difference between the steroid conversation, which of course is still going on in many ways, and the concussion story, to me, is that the concussion story goes from literally the littlest child playing sports all the way to whenever you stop playing sports. As by and large, the performance-enhancing drug story is a little bit in high school, college, of course, but Olympians, pros, etc. So this goes right to into your kitchen, right? This goes into that little athlete you see in the kitchen every morning with grass stains, a boy or girl. This can be something that you can be concerned about for them, as you have pointed out so well, with little kids, and especially football for little kids, and hitting hard, but soccer as well, and headers in soccer, boys and girls. So I think that's the big difference. But I do think this is a story, even though right now we're in the midst of the coronavirus and obviously the pandemic, clearly everything is focused on that. But this is a story, thankfully, that will not go away, that we will be on. I envision the last columns I'm writing, whenever that is, one of them will probably be on the concussion issue. I think it is that important an issue. And again, I hope that's a long time from now, but I promise I'll be on this story as long as I'm a journalist.
Well, we really appreciate all the incredible work that you've been doing on this. And so, yeah, so I think I'm going to loop back to you because I have a couple questions, but I want to do them in the full panel for you. All right?
That sounds great.
Thank you, Christina. I'll see you in a few minutes.
Sounds
all right,
good.
so now, all right, thank you. We're honored to have you. So now I'm going to pass it back to Brandon Boyd, who's going to interview our other two panel members, and then we're going to look forward to this panel discussion. So, B. Boyd, take it over.
Thank you, Chris. Our next guest is Matt Baker, the colleges and recruiting reporter for the Tampa Bay Times. Baker graduated from Medill in 2008 and wrote for the Springfield News Leader and the Tulsa World before heading to Tampa in 2015. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Starting off here, you interviewed our very own Lisa McHale back in 2017 for a piece about flag football versus tackle football and how that was playing out in the Tampa area specifically. What did you learn as a result of writing that piece?
Yeah, so we wanted to look, we started kind of on the global issue of the future of football and the concussion age. And at a certain point, it was kind of too hard and too big to get your arms around. So we kind of decided to focus in on the kids because, the NFL players, they're getting paid, they're adults, they're making the choice to play football. College athletes, we can determine for yourself what they're getting in terms of the benefit and whether it outweighs the risk, but they're at least getting a scholarship and they're adults. They're making a decision about what to do. So to me, the question was, what happens with the kids from as young as 5 is when they start hitting down here through high school who aren't getting anything, they're still minors. Them and their parents are deciding for themselves whether to decide to hit or play tackle football or another sport or flag football. And one of the things that jumped out to me is how many I don't want to say easy, but how many fixes there are, how many things that can be done to figure out safer ways to play in terms of limiting contact. That can be over the course of a season, over the course of an off season. What are steps being done with that? Or limiting contact entirely by playing flag football. One of the things that really jumped out, I thought, just as a guy, that there was a bigger difference between flag and tackle football. But I talked to a guy who was an offensive lineman for the Tampa Bay Bucks. His son was a former 5-star recruit at tight end, signed with the Gators, that sort of thing. And he was telling me, look, I don't want my kids playing tackle football until they get to high school or middle school at the earliest, because I can teach them everything they need to know in flag. The way you wrap up to try and make a tackle in flag football is a lot of the same stuff as you would in tackle. You just don't hit the guy. So to me, that was kind of an eye-opening thing where I don't know if enough people realize that there are some of those kind of, I'd call them almost common sense steps that you can take as a parent, as a young athlete, or as kind of a sports director as a whole to mitigate the risk in some capacity.
Yeah, great. I mean, we appreciate you covering that story. And again, the theme of everything here is getting that information out there for people to make decisions. Question 2 here, you recently wrote a story about Ryan Newman, who back in February suffered the crash in the Daytona 500. And you were on the Zoom call with Newman and his update a couple months out from the injury. And you said that he didn't even know if he suffered a concussion or not in his crash. Do you think that anecdote lines up pretty well with other athletes you've talked to and their own knowledge of concussions and brain trauma?
To some degree, yeah. I'll give NASCAR some credit here because I think they've done a lot of, and NASCAR is a sport, auto racing is a sport where if you get in a wreck, then you're out of the car, they have to check you out, period, end of story. It's not like football where you can go off for a couple plays and come back even if you're not really supposed to. Auto racing is specific on that, so I give them credit for being able to do what they can do. But yeah, he didn't really know the nature of his brain injuries, or his head injuries, I should say, as a whole, from that terrible crash that watching it, I don't know how he walked away from it or how he survived. And then a couple months later to not know necessarily what happened, that to me was interesting. And I don't know if that's just him not wanting to know, because believe me, I've talked to plenty of athletes over the years. I had a college athlete a couple of years ago who said, I don't want to watch the movie Concussion. I don't want to know about it. I'd rather live in ignorance because this is what I want to do. I want to get to the league. So anything like that can kind of affect the way I think and how I hit, and that's not going to get me to my ultimate goal.
Good segue here. You're talking about college. I'll pull up a tweet of yours. This is not a old takes exposed moment, so don't worry about any embarrassment.
I don't have any of those. Don't worry.
Okay, great. I mean, me neither. So this tweet was from a few years back, and you're referencing how Florida State had once not listed quarterback Everett Golson on their injury report, despite him having a diagnosed concussion, and then he ended up missing the next game. This brings up some of the difficulties with covering concussions in college sports and college football, specifically when there's no official injury report like there is in the NFL. How is it sometimes harder to cover concussions in college than in professional sports? And what advice do you have for people trying to navigate those difficulties?
Yeah, well, the main thing is to ask the questions, even if the coach isn't going to answer you. I've worked with and dealt with some coaches who don't talk about injuries at all. I've dealt with some who say, this is the injury report every Monday, that's it. And then the ACC for a little bit had an injury report that I think every Thursday the schools had to say this is what our injuries were. But as you saw with that tweet, FSU, their starting quarterback, had been diagnosed with a concussion. No information about it all week. Didn't show up on the injury report. Saturday, 11:45 for a noon kick. Oh yeah, by the way, update to your depth chart. Starting quarterback Everett Golson is out because of a concussion. What? So you have to understand, of course, the fact that there's some competitive reasons why they're not going to be honest, but it's still up to you to ask the questions and then kind of go from there accordingly. We don't control the access. We don't get to talk to these athletes, at least on the record, in an official capacity. So you kind of deal with what you can, but it's important to know in your head that this is an important issue, and it's my job to ask, even if I'm not going to get an answer on something that important.
Sounds like great advice for journalists, irrespective of whether you're talking about concussions or not. Thank you, Matt. Awesome stuff. We'll be talking again soon here in the full group panel.
Thanks.
All right. We'll bring in our next guest here, Mark Lazerus, our last panelist. Mark graduated from Medill in 2001. He was the sports editor for the Post-Tribune of Northwest Indiana before covering college football for a little bit. Mark then switched to the hockey beat and has covered the Blackhawks for the Chicago Sun-Times. and is now a senior writer for The Athletic, also covering the Blackhawks. Mark, thank you for joining us today, and sorry we made you comb your hair today.
It's the first time in, I think, 68 days I had to. It still looks terrible.
I think we're doing all right. Same deal here, in need of a haircut. But let's take you back to your sports editor days, and I want to ask how often concussions were coming up in the stories you were working on back then.
It wasn't coming up a lot. I was mostly covering high school sports, high school football predominantly, and also some college basketball, mid-major stuff. But my last year there, I did. We always had a big high school football preview section, 72 something pages like that, and I spent the entire summer working on this concussion package. It was like 7 stories, 10,000 words, something like that. So, all the various ramifications of it. I talked to the people at Purdue that were really at the forefront of concussion research, and it was really alarming just to learn. You don't think of high school football, well, they're not making those huge hits that you see in the NFL, but every offensive lineman is getting some kind of subconcussive trauma on almost every single snap of the ball, especially in high school where the fundamentals aren't as good. So you have guys playing the wrong way and putting themselves in perhaps even more danger than the more technical pros do. It was kind of eye-opening to realize that, I had a concussion specialist tell me that soccer is obviously the second most important, second sport with the most concussions. And then the third one was girls basketball, because there's so many collisions and people falling to the floor under the basket. I never would have thought that. I mean, almost every sport out there is a significant risk of concussions. And it really makes you evaluate the game differently the next time you see kids going out there and playing.
Yeah, and good segue here to talking about the pros. You've covered the NHL for a long time, and the NHL has a very checkered history with concussions and CTE and how it's talked about within the league, and it's still the league that diagnoses upper body injuries and lower body injuries. What has your experience been covering concussions in the NHL?
Well, I mean, hockey is, let's face it, probably the most Neanderthalic of the major sports in a lot of ways. Fighting is essentially legal. I mean, you get a little slap on the wrist, 5 minutes, but you can come back into the game after, punching a guy in the face. And, just this year, I can think of a number of examples. Drake Caggiula was out for months with a concussion. And then he comes back on his first game back, drops the glove, and he's taken, haymakers to the skull, repeated, just coming back from a concussion. And then you go in the locker room afterward and you ask guys about it, and they're all like, oh, what a warrior. It really picks up the team to see him do that. And you're trying to phrase your questions like, don't you want him on the ice? Isn't he more important as a player than in this role? This is what you want to see from your guys. He's really, hockey still got that backward mindset. It's getting better. The league as a whole is still, Gary Bettman will tell you that there's no proof that hockey can cause concussions, and they're facing their lawsuits. They're a little behind on that, but I mean, I remember back in 2014, Jonathan Toews. We were in Boston, and Jonathan Toews got boarded face first into the boards by Dennis Seidenberg, and he was on the ice for a solid minute, got up, was woozy, and then started skating to the bench. And then he realized that the Blackhawks were about to go on a power play. So instead of going to the bench, he stayed out there and played. He quickly got a penalty, sat out his 2 minutes in the penalty box, and then left the game. And I felt like I was screaming into the void. I'm yelling, this can't happen. You got to get him out of the game when this happens. Now this year, I can think of a number of instances where Corey Crawford, the goalie, took a Shea Weber slap shot to the skull and was down on the ice for a minute. And, everyone is screaming, get him out of the game, get him out of the game. But the NHL is still far behind this. In one instance, Crawford, he took a slap shot to the head. He played 30 more seconds after a whistle. Then he was removed from the game by a concussion spotter. That's great. That's good. But then he returns 70 seconds later. You can't do a full concussion evaluation in 70 seconds. So the NHL still has a long way to go. And it's important. I mean, I know a lot of reporters don't want to blur that line and get their opinion out there, but you have to call this stuff out. That's our job, is to call out this nonsense when they're putting players' health at risk.
That's a great point. And we'll pull up a tweet of yours here to show another instance where you might not have been shouting into the void. You're tweeting into the void.
It's all shouting.
Yeah. Text shouting. But on February 4th, 2020, so one of the last games here before things shut down, but you tweet, how do you let Stalock stay in the game after taking a knee to the head and lying prone on the ice for a minute? Isn't it somebody's job to take him out now? Then you replied saying, total failure of the concussion protocol system here. What a joke. So you kind of touched on your last answer there, but why do you feel it's important to point these instances out, take on this issue, and raise these types of questions?
Because, I mean, it's our job to hold the league accountable for anything, whether it's, a lockout, a work stoppage, whether it's how they're going to return to play after the pandemic and how they're going to keep players safe and their families and everything like that. This is part of that. It's our job. I'm not an advocate for the Blackhawks. I'm not an advocate for any, but I am, in my own way, an advocate for the sport. I love the sport of hockey. And it makes me angry to see how badly they're handling this. And I've seen what a 70-year-old hockey player looks like, and it's not pretty. They can barely walk, and they're, a lot of times they're suffering from early dementia issues that, can directly be attributed to all the concussions they suffered as players that were just ignored back in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s and 90s. So it matters to me. And, I'm not necessarily a beat writer anymore. I'm more of a columnist and an opinion kind of pundit type. And I think all of us, every beat writer in the country, the game has changed. Every beat writer is expected to inject their opinion into it. And it's our job to point out when the system fails. And the system fails all the time. Last year, I can remember Marcus Kruger was taken out he was done it the right way. He was removed from a game for concussion protocol by a spotter properly and was not allowed back in the game. And he was pissed about it afterwards. He was talking about it should be my decision to get back in the game. And it's our job to point out that, no, it's not your decision, because you're always going to say you want back in the game. The point is to take it out of the players' hands and the coaches.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark. You've given us a lot of good examples to look back for when we're looking for good reporting examples one way or the other of these types of injuries. Chris, I'll hand it back to you now as we bring in the rest of our panelists for the roundtable discussion.
Thank you, Brandon. And I gotta start my video. I love the, thank you, Brandon. I love the fire mark. That was great. All right, so Tyler is working the back end here, and he's gonna populate the whole team together. So we appreciate everyone sticking around for the fun part now, because you guys are, look forward to seeing what you guys think for some of these group questions. All right, we got everybody joining. So we're going to end the webinar with a discussion around some of the bigger questions related to concussion reporting, how you guys might approach some scenarios, see what you learned from the certification. So JA, you were in on our early conversations with the media project, and several times we had to stop and analyze whether we were going too far and whether we need to be careful about not asking journalists to ever be advocates. And I think we just touched on that with the difference between when you're a reporter and when you're a columnist. So I think I look forward to hearing what our columnists, you guys have all done both, think about that. But we'll start with you, and then I would love to hear other opinions. So how do you, as a reporter, take our lessons and use them, but toe the line between reporting and advocacy?
First and foremost, whether you're a beat writer or you're a columnist, you have an obligation to be accurate. And so I didn't see this so much as advocating, taking a side, so much as a quest for greater accuracy in the coverage of concussions. So I think it's very easy to follow these guidelines and not veer off into, if you're a beat writer that's afraid of coming out too strong on one side, well, we all, as Mark alluded to, we're all on the side of truth and all this on the side of accuracy and fairness. So I think following these guidelines doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to advance a cause, but more than anything, you're trying to be accurate and looking out for the safety and welfare of the athletes.
Yeah. What are you other guys thinking? Christine, I think you're on mute right now if you want to hit that. But
So, oh yeah, I think that's, yeah, you guys got me there? Yeah.
Gotcha now. Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, good. Yes, I touched nothing. So anyway, it's always the best policy on these things. Yeah, I've read them. I actually haven't officially signed it or, an official whatever. And I'll probably keep it that way for the simple reason of what you're saying is that, I feel very comfortable. Of course, I want knowledge. JA is absolutely right. The more information, the better. That is the credo of any journalist, right? I'm sure all of us have over-reported almost every story we've ever done with pages and pages, and then you're cutting things left and right. You're not able to use the quotes you'd like to use, et cetera, on any topic. And so I appreciate every piece of information you guys have given me. And I also think as the independence of the journalist, I don't know that I need to actually sign it or be a part of it officially. The knowledge is important, and I appreciate you guys. And of course, every time I were to quote you, Chris, of course, I would talk about your work and what you're doing. And I think that's a good role for me as a journalist to kind of handle it that way. But we can never have enough information about something that impacts not only our professional athletes, but our children. And so thank you for continuing to give us the up-to-date information that allows us to do our jobs the best that we can.
I think for younger journalists, the real value in this program that going through that certification was the way you word your questions to players and to coaches alike, I think that's important. Don't give them a way to weasel out of the question. And, it's different for me. When I first started covering the Blackhawks, Joel Quenneville was the coach, and he's a kind of this old school, 80s playing style, and never talked about concussions. Everything was upper body, lower body, and he would always evade everything. And now the coach is Jeremy Colleton, a player whose career ended because of concussion. So he's very sensitive to the fact. And he will talk openly about what it's like to deal with that. And, the Blackhawks use the word concussion now. They talk about injuries specifically, and that makes a big difference because you can ask a question, but it's important to know not to ask, when do you expect so-and-so to be back? Because nobody's going to know. But it's to say, how is he doing today? Is he making progress today? What are his symptoms like? And they're not going to give you a lot of information. But if you say, when is he going to be back? They're going to say, I don't know. And they're right. And then they don't have to answer any more questions about it. So there's value in teaching younger journalists who are dealing with this for the first time, who haven't been through this before, on the verbiage that you use in asking these kinds of questions to get straight answers.
Mark, I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about being a fan of the sport and what you cover, and that's part of what you do, and holding people accountable to kind of what they say. I think that's exactly right. I think that's kind of the way to approach it without being an advocate, because this is what they say they're supposed to do. Is this working? Are they doing what they say? And that's a way to, like I said, you don't have to be, oh, this is ridiculous or not. You can say that. I think just kind of a general journalistic thing. Like Jay said earlier, the idea that the beat guy and columnist, that line has blurred. Now, what I try and do is say, whatever the story is that day, that's what I need to write, period. And there are games where somebody takes a hellacious hit and they're woozy and they come back in or whatever. And if that's the story, then you need to say whatever the story is, period. But in more kind of routine instances where somebody gets knocked out of the game, whatever it may be, absolutely, hold them accountable. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Yes or no, and then ask the questions appropriately.
Well, so you guys have mentioned accountability. I think that's a great way to look at this, because I think about in Australia, there's actually one of the I believe the National Rugby League was for a while fining teams when they breached concussion protocol, and so they actually did investigations, and it was some significant fines. What do you think American sports record has been on being accountable for their own concussion protocols, and I guess it's sort of the layup here, like your role in making these protocols more than just on paper?
Well, that's just it. For the NHL, they have a protocol. It only came out, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, 2016 or 2017. But it's this nebulous thing where they don't have any specifics. They never will talk about it. So if you ask, was protocol followed, they plead the fifth on that. So there is no accountability in the NHL whatsoever. And I think the NHL is a little behind, where the NFL has kind of acknowledged the concussion issue and is a little more proactive about it. The NHL is still fighting these lawsuits. It's going to be years before they even admit concussions exist as a league and that they're problematic. So it's going to take a while, and it's going to take a lot of beating that same drum and beating that dead horse over and over again.
And I think there are different issues that are particular to each individual sport and the cultures of those sports. In the NBA, for example, it's a star-driven league, and the stars carry a lot of power and sway over that league. And I remember a time Kobe Bryant, it looked like he suffered a concussion actually in the All-Star game when Dwayne Wade smacked him across the head. And there were some lingering issues now as they returned to regular season play, and he was being investigated. And at one point, they announced that he was in the concussion protocol, and then all of a sudden he wasn't. And, talking to Kobe Bryant and seeing the statements that were put out by the Lakers, it was pretty evident that Kobe said, "What are you doing? I'm not concussed because I'm Kobe Bryant, and I say so." And you even had the medical professionals sort of back down and said, well, it's not necessarily a concussion. It might have actually been whiplash and a neck injury.
Traumatic migraine, something,
They started changing the verbiage, and it was pretty evident that it was because Kobe had said so. Mark, I want to ask you how much of the hockey issue is just, given the culture, you alluded to it earlier, or Matt did, how, a sprained knee can be a lower body injury. And so given that that's the nature of the business, the reluctance to classify a concussion as anything other than an upper body injury, and how you have to fight against that, and hockey writers have to fight against that. Yeah,
and I have to say there has been progress in recent years. It's getting a little bit better, but I think hockey's the biggest kind of tough guy sport there is, where that kind of powering through that you were all talking about earlier, that's still valued in hockey, I think, whereas other sports are kind of realizing that, doing what's best for the team, and sometimes that means, sitting yourself down is more important. Hockey still has that warrior culture, and like I talked about with that Drake Kajula fight. So it is hard when not all the teams, there's no official injury reports in the NHL. It's always, it's up to the teams to decide how they talk about these things. Corey Crawford was out for the better part of 2 seasons. He missed almost 2 full seasons with 2 separate concussions. And it wasn't until he came back that the Blackhawks said, oh yeah, it was a concussion. That's just the way the sport is. And it's, the NHL is always behind the times. The NHL, just found analytics 5 years ago. So it's going to be a little while before they get to, talking about concussions properly, but there is progress. And, when a team like the Blackhawks, which was one of the biggest offenders of ignoring and not talking about concussions, takes the step to actually identify them and talk about timelines and talk honestly about it, that's a really positive sign. But they're not going to do it on their own. It's going to have to come from a push from fans, from media, from players themselves are going to have to step up to push them along, because the NHL is not going to do it on its own.
No, it's interesting when you talk about pushing from fans. Of course, the health and well-being of athletes, right, is going to make a better product eventually on the field of play, right? Actually, probably right away on the field of play. It will elongate potentially athletes' careers. But because we have such a short-term memory, we're very impatient as a society. I think there's some parallels actually with what we've seen of how people have handled the pandemic over the last, 2 months and 2.5 months, whatever. I think they're very similar in some ways. That it's like, what have you done for me lately? Yeah, he might be concussed, but boy, we need him in the game this coming week, right? And the point I think we were making earlier about the athlete's career. The length of an NFL career, I haven't looked recently, but I think it's 3 years maybe, right? So for every Peyton Manning, there's someone who or Tom Brady, there's someone who has a cup of coffee, right? Or 10 guys that have a cup of coffee and then they're out of the league. Same with all these sports and women's as well, men's and women's. So the thought of losing that opportunity, right? a game or 2 or 3 or a week's worth or a month's worth of games, that can be a devastating thought to a young athlete, college or pro. Pro, obviously, you're throwing in the money aspect of it as well. This is their career. And so you've got this real interesting push-pull, the American way, right? Fight through it, no patience, just throw them back out there. We want to win at all costs. These are all things that we've all felt as fans, some way or other. And now, of course, we're all journalists and we're covering it. So this conversation about concussions, in my mind anyway, will continue to fight these headwinds of that sense of, put them back in and I want to play. And that's why it's so important we have these conversations. And Chris, it's so important you're out there doing all the interviews you're doing, because otherwise you don't have anyone pushing. And no matter what we all think is the right thing to do, how often do people do the right thing versus I want my guy back on the field for this Sunday's game?
Yeah.
And some of that is an athlete-driven thing too, kind of like what you were saying with Kobe J.A. I'm thinking of NASCAR specifically. I could never imagine Dale Earnhardt Sr. taking himself out of races because of concussions. But his son, Dale Jr., was so outspoken about his issues and his injuries. And then that's, kind of led to his retirement and what have you. So I think that kind of was a major moment for auto racing to say, hey, there's an issue here. It's okay to take time off. We're trying to be manly or whatever, but this is an important issue. We need to acknowledge it, even if it means ending our career early, because there's a life after racing, just as there's a life after football and basketball and baseball. So we have our part to do, the fans have their part to do, but it's to some degree, I think it's best when the athletes themselves take some of the ownership and realize, hey, there's more to life than this. Then we need to be okay to take ourselves out.
I love it. So I want to throw at you a quick question for Mark and Matt. Now that you took the certification, was there anything there that surprised you as to some of the guidelines that were there? And while you think about that answer, we're actually going to start putting up a video because I want to give a hypothetical scenario and see how you guys respond. But anything that was surprising?
I don't know if surprising is the right word. I mean, it does make you think, because it's something, I've been covering sports now at all levels for almost 20 years, and it's not something I think about. I don't think about the words I use. I've honed the vocabulary I use over the years by experience. And it's interesting to stop and think, well, I probably have said, head injury versus brain injury, or I might have said, he got, I don't think I used terms like bell rung and things like that, but it makes you think about the words you use, because you don't want to create any wiggle room. You want to be clear and direct as possible, and not leave any margin for error. So by taking the quiz and thinking about the words you use, it's just another thing. The next time a concussion comes up, and it will come up, I will have actually thought about the words I use for a change instead of just, the word vomit that usually comes out of my mouth.
No, I'm with you exactly. Maybe think a little bit more. Try to choose my words carefully, but sometimes you're on deadline, whatever. You're so focused, you're not thinking with each and every word, but with something that's important, that we all acknowledge is important. Everybody does. We need to choose our words carefully and not treat it lightly.
And we've all listened to our own interviews going back and transcribing and just wanted to slam our head against the desk after hearing the words we use. So
I love it. All right. Well, thanks, guys. All right. So now we're going to watch a little clip from the Astros-Yankees game in 2015. And I will say, I don't think we have express written consent from Major League Baseball, but this is a fair use situation. So let's go ahead and roll the tape. You're going to see a player hit and briefly evaluated before coming back. So this is a scenario that happens very frequently in baseball, the old foul tip to the mask. Catchers are about a third of concussions in baseball. They're only one of 9 positions. We advocate through our program that you really can't do a full concussion evaluation unless you have 8 to 10 minutes. Otherwise, you're not really checking all the domains. So you see this person evaluated, you see them stay in the game. But obviously they came out to evaluate him because they saw signs of concussion. So how do you report on something like this where there's a clear head impact, there's objective or subjective signs that make you raise your head, a very quick evaluation, and the player's returned? What's it appropriate to talk about there?
Well, one of the things that comes through clearly through the program and the protocol is, and you just used the word, was he displaying signs of a concussion rather than symptoms? And symptoms are something that can only be revealed through an examination and really through the honesty of the person that's being questioned and examined. But somebody observing from the press box can't see symptoms of a concussion. They can only see, or can't report symptoms of a concussion. They can only see signs. So the first thing is just the language and the terminology that he exhibited signs rather than symptoms.
And I think if you have the luxury, if you're with a news organization that has both a columnist and a beat writer there, which the locals should, or even if you're just watching the game on TV, so many columns can be written nationally or for various websites or newspapers, news organizations, obviously even of big events that happen even if you're not physically there. That's happening more and more and will continue clearly to happen more and more. I think a columnist can say, you can ask all those questions. Why wasn't he taken out? How can you make this evaluation in that short a period of time? I think in fact, I would feel very comfortable doing that column myself. Writing those issues, talking about that. To J.A.'s point, we're not doctors. We have no idea what happened. But you certainly, common sense tells you, in addition to all of your wonderful guidance, is that you can certainly, as a columnist, raise all those questions and even say that you could even make the case, I think, that he should have been taken out of the game. It's one game out of 162 games. What in the world are you doing for the future health of this young man? And also the message it's sending to every Little League baseball player and every Little League parent and every high school baseball and softball and on it goes. The message, the role model aspect of it as well. The beat writer, in my mind, then handles the news. They looked at him for 2 minutes, kept him back in the game, and then however he played the rest of the way.
There's a pitfall that you could fall into as a columnist there too, by pointing out it was 9-0. What do you have to lose by taking him out of the game? And that's an irrelevant fact of that, but that's how a lot of people are going to look at it. It was 9-0. You could take him out of the game. I don't care if it's the 15th inning of Game 7 and it's a tie game. If someone has a concussion, you have to remove them from the game. So you have to be careful not to fall into some of those pitfalls where you kind of make it conditional on the situation. This is a black or white issue. Either he's concussed or he's not. Now, there's something you could, there's I don't know baseball's protocol, but I know that once you leave the game, you can't come back in. Maybe they have to create some kind of a loophole where if you are removed for concussion protocol and you are then cleared, you are then allowed to enter the game again. That's an issue that's going to play in baseball because people are going to be reluctant to take out their only catcher, or they only got one backup catcher and they got 6 innings left to play. So you have to create a whole awareness about the entire situation and not just treat it in its own isolated world. You have to treat it in the bigger picture too.
And you have to ask the manager, I think, about some of these things. You were out there. What were you looking at? How was he seeming to you? How was he answering whatever questions or whatever was done? And why did you keep him in? Just that simple question, why did you keep him in? I don't think you have to ask it in a leading manner, in an upset manner, but a point blank, why did you keep him in? And to report what he says and then figure out whether that was, let people decide whether that was the right or wrong thing based on whatever other information you get out of that.
All great answers. All right, so we're getting some good questions in from the audience. And so with our last few minutes here, I want to hit on some of those. So Walt Verson has asked, the pros are fair game for sure, but what about schools? What about non-professionals and privacy issues? How much of a right do we have in chasing down someone's brain injury history? Like think about a college football player who's not being paid for what he does. What do you guys think about that?
Well, part of that goes from a number of schools, especially the high-profile programs, will ask their student athletes to sign a waiver that allows them, because technically the school isn't allowed to report if they have a sprained ankle, and it all falls under the HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portable. I forget the last 2 letters of the acronym, but it's basically the Health Privacy Act that technically forbids them from disclosing any medical type information. But a number of universities ask them to sign a waiver that allows them to report, for the purposes of helping with the accuracy of those who are covering the program. So once you do that, that then gives you the license. So I think, asking them or making sure that waiver includes the right to discuss brain injuries and potential concussions, and that way you're covered in that regard.
My general philosophy when covering college sports, which is, that's what I do, if it affects what happens on the field, by and large, it's fair game. So I don't think we need to necessarily go into the kid's medical history, that sort of thing. But if it affects whether he can play on Saturday, then I think that's fair game. And I think most coaches recognize that and understand that injuries are part of that. They might say, I don't talk about injuries. Okay, well, then you try. And if you try and have another way to try and get the information, that's fine. But you just have to at least make the effort and hear what they say and listen to it and then hold them accountable.
It's trickier when you're talking about high school sports, obviously. These are actual kids. But there's been plenty of issues where that does come up, and you run it by their parents. You say, hey, your son talked to me today about the fact that he had a concussion, but he's not supposed to do that. Is it okay with you if I write about this? And I think most parents are understanding, and yeah, they do want that story out there. I mean, it depends on where you are. Where I was a sports editor of an area where high school sports was really big deal, and they demanded to be treated like a big deal. If you want to be treated all positively, there's going to be some less than positive stuff too. That just comes with the game. Now, if you're writing about, the JV Tiddlywinks team and, you're getting really critical of the way they're handling a kid, I'm not sure where the benefit from that is. But you can still talk about it in youth sports. You just have to get parental permission to do so.
And I'll pull out my crystal ball here and say that I'll bet you each year that goes by, more and more of these athletes, be they high school athletes or college athletes, will feel comfortable talking about the concussions they've had. They are also growing up in this environment where we all feel more comfortable discussing it. It's more important to discuss it. I think every day that goes by, I don't know what you guys think about this, but every day that goes by, there's a 12-year-old girl playing soccer right now who's so much more aware of the concussion issue than the 51 or 52-year-old Brandy Chastain ever was at 12, or even probably up until the last 10 years of her 10, 12 years, whatever, of her life. So the knowledge that that's trickling down, or hopefully, hitting these kids in a big way, whether it be from their parents, their coaches, just training programs, whether it be from the national governing body and the youth soccer, youth sports, volleyball, you name it. These kids are wiser and they're smarter. And I think they also, the taboo, right? The question of, oh, I don't want to admit this. Well, I think we'll see stories where people are far more, I've already seen a few, and just anecdotally, of, so, oh yeah, I had a concussion freshman year, I had to miss half the lacrosse season, whatever. I think we're seeing more and more of this, and my guess is the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see people very comfortable about it, which again then helps the entire conversation, going back to those little kids that are just going to be starting out.
And we play into that too. That's a big part of our role, is to educate. I mean, we are in a lot of ways the liaison between fans and athletes to other athletes. And the more information we provide, there is news value in that, because it's educating people and making them take care of themselves better. And that's not advocacy journalism. That's just journalism. Informing the public is our primary responsibility.
Yeah. Well, I think those are great sentiments to end on. And I just want to mention as a comment that's an aside from an athletic trainer, talk about how important it is. They said it's frustrating when you hear players say, well, the pros do it. And so that modeling is very important. And so you guys holding leagues accountable for their own protocols is so critical. So I want to thank you guys for the work that you do in educating kids. And I'll do a little wrap up here. But Mark, Matt, Christine, J.A., you guys are fabulous and really appreciate having you. We're honored to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. So as a thank you to the Medill School of Journalism, or a big thank you to the Medill School of Journalism for your help organizing this webinar. We've recorded it. We're posting it to our social media channels early next week. So we hope you'll take the time, if you're watching, to become concussion reporting certified and spread the word so others will too. So here's a final look at the links for how to get involved with the media project and Brandon's email if you have any questions. Doing a terrific job leading the program. So long, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.